I affirm the resolution resolved the United States ought to substantially reduce its military presence in the West Asia North Africa region. Definition: Summary defines the West Asia North Africa or WANA region as including the countries of Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Bahrain, Qatar, Egypt, UAE, Israel, Iran, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Libya, Mauritania, Morocco, Oman, Palestine, Western Sahara, Syria, Sudan, Tunisia, Turkey, and Yemen. My strain of this bit is utilitarianism or maximizing societal well-being. Prefer because it's the most practical theory of justice. Bowden 09 finds that institutions are faced with complex and difficult moral issues. People need a relatively straightforward way of making decisions, and utilitarianism provides that method. Rogers Lepore furthers that practically speaking, no system of justice will ever meet the interests of every citizen in its society. So utilitarians say that the best system of justice brings the greatest total of happiness to society as a whole. Contention 1. U.S. military presence in the WANA region is not harmful to both the civilians of the region and the U.S. The U.S. has caused too many casualties to the civilians in the WANA region. Beaumont 21, U.S. actions killed at least 22,679 civilians, potentially as high as 48,308. In 2003, a minimum of 5,529 civilians were killed, almost all during the invasion of Iraq year. In 2017, at least 4,931 civilians were killed, the vast majority in the coalition bombing of Iraq and Syria. Going by maximum estimates, up to 19,623 were killed. U.S. drone strikes cause casualties. Rogoski 22, drone strikes occur legally in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Libya. Strikes in Yemen increased threefold. U.S. military presence encourages terrorism. Hudson 20, drone strikes provide motivation for retaliation, and increasing number of drone strikes increases the number of retaliation attacks. For every high-profile attack, many more low-profile attacks take place. By the accidental guerrilla phenomenon, a local rejection of external forces, attacks result in an anti-American sentiment. Hudson continues, testing national sovereignty puts fragile governing structures in the target country under enormous pressure while exacerbating social volatility. Military presence in WANA harms both the countries and the U.S. Pillar et al. 20. The war in Iraq incurred hundreds of thousands of Iraqi casualties, thousands of American casualties, and trillions in dollars of expenditure and political harm. This intervention failed to give longer-term peace and stability, triggered an extended civil war, stimulating sectarian conflict inside and outside Iraq, and produced the conditions for the emergence of ISIS. Military intervention in 2011 left Libya in chaos, had a destabilizing effect beyond Libya's borders, increasing terrorist groups in Africa. U.S. support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen has resulted in the world's worst ongoing humanitarian catastrophe. U.S. military engagement in the region has routinely raised tensions, heightened the risk of wider war, and entrapped the U.S. in a region no longer vital to national security. U.S. military exacerbates abuses that contribute to instability, facilitated its continued occupation of Palestinian territory. U.S. military presence inspires terrorism. Pillar et al. 20. The foremost driver of anti-U.S. terrorism has been the U.S. military presence. The last time Hezbollah or Iran was involved in a terrorist attack aimed at the U.S. was aimed directly at the U.S. military presence in the Persian Gulf area. The origins of al-Qaeda lie primarily in resentments over the U.S. military presence. U.S. military buildup in Saudi Arabia radicalized Osama bin Laden. The single most important step the U.S. could take to reduce anti-U.S. terrorism is to draw down its military presence overseas, especially in the Middle East. Most terrorist organizations are not defeated by military operations, but by police and intelligence actions and cooperation. ISIS began as a direct result of the chaos and communal strife unleashed by the U.S. military expedition. Contention 2, the U.S. ought to decrease its presence in the WANA region and increase presence in East Asia. The U.S. ought to decrease military presence in the WANA region for the ongoing Israel-Hamas war. Wherein Kavanaugh 23, American military forces and Iranian-backed proxies are now engaged in near-daily tit-for-tat strikes. Anti-Americanism is at an all-time high, and Washington's longtime Arab allies, while eager to see the end of the Hamas, are equally incensed by the devastation in Gaza. This gives America's competitors in the Middle East, China, and Russia a new opening to exploit. They continue following the Hamas assault on Israel. Biden bolstered presence with the addition of fighter aircraft, along with thousands of U.S. military personnel. The stated goal is to prevent the current conflict from expanding, but the injection of forces is likely to create new risks of escalation instead. Instead, the U.S. should shift forces to East Asia. Zafar 22, changing geopolitical dynamics, with China's emergence as a key player and the declining role of the U.S. as a superpower, have shifted focus towards the Asia-Pacific region. China is trying to challenge the status quo thus far maintained by the U.S., consistently working upon its economic, human resource, and military development to expand its clout over the neighborhood and beyond. Xi Jinping plans to surpass the U.S. by 2049, intends to overtake America by means of influence and national strength. The goal in the near future is a new order led by China instead of the U.S. Jeremy 23, the Chinese military sinks Vietnamese fishing vessels using military aircraft to harass Malaysian offshore energy exploration, deploying water cannons and military-grade lasers to block and target Philippine resupply boats. Japanese and South Korean leaders strongly condemned the PRC's aggressive behavior in the South China Sea. And Kavanaugh 23. Biden's costly overstretch strains the U.S. military resources, leaving Washington unprepared for future crises in the Indo-Pacific, where the U.S. faces its most formidable competitor in China. Large Middle East deployments will wear down U.S. military assets and personnel and divert investments needed to deter Beijing. Already compromises are being made. U.S. air defense systems are recently deployed to the Middle East will not be available in Asia to defend against China's missile threat. The risks created by the sustained U.S. military presence in the Middle East can only be addressed by reducing that presence. Washington should further decrease and consolidate its military footprint across a smaller number of U.S. bases in strategic locations, protecting U.S. interests with less exposure. Both the U.S. and the Middle East will be better off if Washington pulls back its military presence rather than doubling down. Therefore, I strongly urge an affirmative ballot. I stand up for cross.
Okay. I'll start at my first question. So how does substantial reduction solve all the impacts that you're talking about?
Right. So, as I talked about in my first contention, we can see the U.S. military presence in the Wana region is harmful to the civilian division and the U.S. We talked about in Hudson 20 and Pillar et al. 20, how the U.S. military presence has actually led to U.S. military presence has led to further the accidental guerrilla phenomenon, which means that the U.S. attacks result in an anti-American sentiment among the civilians, which increases terrorists because it gives them an excuse to use against the Americans.
You're calling for substantial. You're not calling for a full withdrawal. How does a substantial withdrawal solve it?
Sorry, I cannot hear what you're saying.
How does a substantial withdrawal solve the impact? Because
right, so if we're substantially withdrawing from the the amount of drone strikes, first of all, they need to decrease because again, as we've seen, it's caused a lot of anti-American sentiment and has actually furthered terrorist organizations further. And we can see how Pillar et al. 20 shows how anti-American, how the foremost driver of anti-US terrorism has been U.S. military presence. What this means is if we draw back from the Middle East, it's not only going to give U.S. further hegemony, which can lead to a lessening of totalitarian regimes, it also is going to reduce the amount of casualties that we can see.
Since U.S. has been targeted for anti-Americanism, then do you recommend like after we withdraw certain troops, we'll just leave the rest of the troops there being stay attacked?
Sorry, say that again.
So like, because you said U.S. has been targeted for anti-Americanism. So do you recommend we just let the remaining troops in the Wana region just be targeted to be attacked?
We're not saying, I'm sorry, I'm not getting, are you asking like if we should
like when you withdraw, when you substantially withdraw, there will be remaining troops in Awana, right?
Yes.
Then do you think these troops just deserve to be attacked by those terrorist groups?
I'm not saying the troops should be attacked. I'm saying even if some amount of troops are needed to help the West Asian North Africa region, we need to substantially reduce that number because it's actually causing further problems. And we're not saying that we're abandoning our troops to terrorists. What we're saying is that even though if we can, our first step is to substantially reduce the army in the Middle East so that we can see less civilian attacks, we can see less terrorist organizations due to the accidental guerrilla phenomenon. We also talk about how the reason we need to reduce this is because we need to increase presence in East Asia, which is necessary to stop China's ongoing attempts at hegemony.
China influence is bad?
Sorry, what?
China influence is bad?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
I agree, China influence is bad?
Yes.
Okay, then why do you think U.S. is not prepared for the war with China or whatsoever?
I'm saying that if a lot of U.S. military forces are currently in the West Asia North Africa region, and we've stayed there for decades, we've stayed there for over 20 years, and that has done absolutely nothing to reduce conflict, to reduce civilian casualties in the West Asia North Africa region. So instead of that, we should be shifting our resources to China, where we have the probability of actually making an impact, rather than beating a dead horse in a state that we've stayed in for 20 years.
I negate the resolution. I would like to offer several observations. 1. Substantial. Defined by dictionary of military terms as permanent as opposed to temporary. It is the firm's burden to defend an all-term permanent military presence reduction in all Wana nations. If the negative wins, U.S. ought to preserve its flexibility in deploying forces. Vote negative. My value is morality, and my value criterion is utilitarianism. Now onto offense. So contention 1, Saudi Arabia. U.S.-Saudi relations are at crossroads. Continue withdrawal destroys perceived U.S. security commitment to Saudi. Boma et al. 23. Decades-long arrangement in which the U.S. guarantee Saudi security may be on the ropes. Washington is eager to downsize commitments in the Middle East. Riyadh is contending with the Kuwaiti regional security and declining trust in American security assurances. Military reduction deprives CENTEM of means to secure these interests. Advancing towards a nuclear Iran is advancing towards a nuclear weapon, heightening Saudi Arabia's sense of insecurity. American military power remains unmatched, but past experience leave Riyadh wondering whether the U.S. will actually employ its military. Loss of assurances causes Saudi proliferation. Threats of Iran amplifies their link and causes wider arm race. Broken during December 11. Denial of security assistance with punishing Saudi antagonized the Middle East by incentivizing the proliferation of nuclear capabilities. The Iran deal heightened a sense of vulnerability in Riyadh. Iran is an existential threat to secure forestalling spread of nuclear capabilities. Obama committed to continue to support and defend Saudi Arabia. Protection that we provide the Gulf is far greater deterrent than they could ever achieve by developing their own nuclear stockpiles. Withdrawing U.S. commitments sows distrust. If America's commitment to security is diminished, the Saudis will seek nuclear capabilities. The Saudi nuclear capability will ignite a race in the Gulf. Other countries will follow. What comes next? A regional war. Middle East nuclear arm race goes nuclear. Space Event 22. A nuclear Middle East will bring the war exponentially close to nuclear war. Spread will catalyze conventional interstate conflicts, and growing proxy fights that will become more dangerous. Ability to promote political stability would dramatically decline. Whoever got the bomb conduct conventional or proxy attacks with impunity. There's a history of new nuclear weapon states acting more aggressively. Israel, Egypt, China, Pakistan. If another state acquire nuclear, conflicts turn nuclear will be real. New nuclear weapon states will lack organizational controls, making accidents more likely. Risk of nuclear arms falling into hands of terrorists will increase. New core causes extinction. STAR 15. A war fought with nuclear weapons will be a mass extinction event that ends human history. Continuous deterrence. Iran is currently engaged in a proxy war with the U.S. Due to military presence, U.S. successfully deter these attacks. Without U.S. presence, these attacks will be on American soil. Another 911 will resurge. Friedman March 5th. U.S. has destroyed most of incoming. Tehran off when U.S. decided to demonstrate. Tehran option was capped off when U.S. decided to demonstrate Iran as proxies, kind of combined warfare the U.S. can deploy. Iran has been observing ceasefire ever since. U.S. withdrawal guaranteed the Middle East war, deterrence, power vacuum, and ally proliferation. Ocean Star 21. Threat to non-proliferation has been prominent with increasing Iranian nuclear stockpiles. Iran has expanded Lebanization to Syria and Iraq. Iran has been clear in its objective to dry U.S. out, which is viewed as necessary for Tehran for its hegemonic goals. Russia and Turkey has aspirations, and the region perceives U.S. as ready to withdraw. Those who threaten expanded ability to project power are hedging by building military capabilities. These negative dynamics are driven by the mere perception, and they will be accelerated if withdrawal becomes a reality. Every U.S. administration and partner believes presence protected freedom of navigation and prevent a wider regional war. Contingent 3 is flexibility. U.S. government has an obligation to maintain its deployment flexibility. Military presence will allow U.S. to obtain more posture flexibility in deploying military in the future while maintaining regional stability and avoid fill-in. Stop 21. National defense strategy means regional partners have a say in U.S. nuclear negotiation with Iran and have military capabilities. Once developed, regional partners will be less focused on the raw number of American military and stop their hedging towards China and Russia. U.S. will acquire flexibility to pursue its priority in the Indo-Pacific. Because ought to in a resolution, all the withdrawal is an obligation and substantial is permanent. So U.S. does not have the obligation to hurt its own interests and lives and makes an impact that is irreversible. Now onto my opponent's case. So first of all, under contention 1, link turn, after U.S. withdrawal, there will automatically be a power vacuum. Normally, local forces or great powers and terrorist groups will fill in. Consider Afghanistan as an example, which worsens human rights abuses. Amnesty 22, restrictions on women's rights, freedom of the media, and freedom of expression increased exponentially. Taliban conducted extrajudicial executions, arbitrary arrest, torture, and unlawful detention of perceived opponents with impunity, creating an atmosphere of fear. Extreme poverty increased, exacerbated by drought and other natural disasters. Afghanistan was the only country in the world where girls were banned from attending secondary school. To link turn, AFF exacerbates human rights violations. China and Russia will fill in and make supports to terrorist groups. 3, non-unique. Any other places the U.S. have troops can cause human rights abuses. U.S. bases in Europe and South Korea and Japan, and we're not going to withdraw from all these places. So we need to focus on the bigger picture. And 4, AFF provides no solvency. They're only substantially withdrawn. They cannot solve the entire abuse that they're talking about. And 5, countries like Iran will become worse if they left unchecked. Iran can develop nukes with North Korea. Human rights abuses will exacerbate more. This is the after my opponents talking about the al-Assad government in Syria is using banned chemical weapons on their civilians. If U.S. withdraw, there will be more of these instances. And Skip to 7. In the status quo, 95% of terrorism is gone, but resurgency still remains. American forces in Iraq and Syria are key to completely eradicate ISIS and other terrorist groups. Rollback 23. U.S. forces improve security or counterterrorism operations to help restore local governance and security. If U.S. withdrawal necessary efforts against ISIS will likely fall apart quickly. ISIS still emboldened to intensify operations in Syria. Withdrawal will encourage a new invasion of northeastern Syria, including diplomatic pushback. The SDF will likely collapse and will certainly stop fighting for ISIS. The withdrawal could lead to a bloody free-for-all. And removing military presence make terrorism worse by emboldening extremism because they believe they have won and invoke more impacts that cause terrorism. And now skip to contention 2. So 1, in response to my opponent's contention 2, 1, U.S. is not short on military troops anywhere. U.S. military defense readiness says they can simultaneously fight 2 global conflicts. And 2, refer to my SAP 21 evidence, we can maintain military presence and want to first to defeat terrorist groups, assure alliances, and then deploy them to Indo-Pacific to target China without any opportunity costs. This is the most strategic method under utilitarianism. And 3, my opponent cannot provide a specific way that U.S. withdraws and moves somewhere else. Fiat just removes presence. They cannot wave a magic wand that puts in somewhere else. And 4, they have no terminal impact as to what happens if we don't move presence into the region. They just say China is bad and we have to deter them, but don't explain anything what happens if we don't. So judge, you should vote for NEG because we're eliminating the chances of nuclear war. We're eliminating chances of life being lost and caused by more human rights abuses if you vote for AFF. So I urge you for negative ballot. Thank you.
Okay, so I noticed you were talking about in your first contention about Saudi proliferation. You agree that currently Iran's nuclear advance is going to make it very easy, like for Iran to get nuclear weapons pretty soon, correct?
Yes, because
Okay, thank you. That's all I needed. So if we say that Iran's nuclear advance is happening, we've stayed in the Middle East for decades and decades, and we can still see that Iran has been proliferating. So how are we actually deterring nuclear proliferation at all if we've stayed there for years and years and it's still happening?
Because currently, right now, Iran is not acting nuclear proliferation because of U.S. deterrence. So if U.S. withdrawal, Iran will become more aggressive towards neighboring countries, and that's why
But currently Iran has been building the technology needed for nuclear proliferation, correct? I think that's
They
what
have
you
not
just said.
built it. They have not triggered the brink to build nuclear weapons. But if U.S. withdrawal, they will feel
Wait,
no.
sorry. Okay. So do you think that Iran currently has the technologies for nuclear advance or not?
Iran can have certain technologies, but currently U.S.
Does it currently?
region has deterred them from actually proliferating nuclear weapons because they have not built any nuclear weapons right now.
All right. And you were talking about deterrence. We were talking about Iran proxy wars, correct? So do you know why Iran has been attacking the US in the proxy wars? What's the reason behind that?
Because Iran attacks US because they feel like they can threaten other countries. Like in my card,
Why specifically the US? What do they want from the US?
because they want to show they are the hegemon in the region. They want to degrade US influence in the region and let US allies like Saudi Arabia to feel
Right.
more.
So as I explained in my case, the last time Iran attacked the US was aimed directly at US military presence in the Persian Gulf area, which is if it's attacking the US because of their presence in the Middle East, wouldn't it be better if we just went out of the Middle East so there wouldn't be the reason for their attacks in the first place?
No, because first of all, if we attacked, then these attacks will be targeted towards US mainland because they still have the anti-Americanism because you did not solve it at all by simply withdrawing. We are saying there to
Right. What
deter.
is the cause of the anti-Americanism? You keep talking about anti-Americanism. What is the cause of that?
The cause of that because they need because they view US as the main target in the world because they feel like US is the main hegemon in the world and they want to degrade US power influence over the world and make
All
them
right.
expand.
Thank you. And you were talking about okay, so in your third contention, can you explain like what the impact of your third contention is?
Oh, so my third contention is like, because the ought to implies in the resolution and substantial means permanent, US does not have the obligation to hurt its interests and lives and make an irreversible impact. And because like my Saudi Arabia first contention talks about, people are feeling threatened. So if US stay there, we can assure our alliances and then further have the flexibility to withdraw from to Indo-Pacific. And however, in the resolution implies that US have the obligation for permanent withdrawal, but I said we don't have it.
Time begins Now, Judge, let's start off with my opponent's first contention. She talks about Saudi Arabian proliferation. However, we can see that if we actually enact the negative, it'll surely lead to nuclear war. We can see Davenport 24 explains that the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency reiterates concerns about Iran's advancing nuclear program and called for diplomacy with Tehran, emphasizes that diplomacy is necessary to prevent the situation deteriorating to a degree where it would be impossible to retrieve it. Judge, what this means is we need to call for diplomacy rather than military presence. Historically, we can see that the U.S. Has had decades and decades of military presence in the Middle East, and yet has done nothing. We can see my card explains how Tehran is actually only like a couple of weeks away from being able to create a nuclear weapon, and despite the U.S.'s presence, it has done nothing to stop Iran. So we can see that my card explains how diplomacy would actually solve for would actually solve for Iran's nuclear proliferation, which means that Saudi Arabia also wouldn't proliferate because Saudi Arabia is worried about Iran. So this will actually cut it off. Judge, if we negate, then what this is going to do is the U.S. military presence is going to make Iran continue proliferating, and we're not going to act diplomacy. And the reason that I talked about this in my case as well, but the reason that the last time Iran attacked the U.S. was when U.S. had a military presence in the Persian Gulf area. So the reason that Iran is attacking the U.S. or is trying to proliferate in the first place is due to U.S. military presence. So if we take away the U.S. military presence, they're going to stop proliferating, and they're going to move back their troops that are currently attacking the U.S. The reason that they're attacking is due to U.S. military presence, so that removes the need of it at all. Additionally, nuclear war has very little probability due to mutually assured destruction. So even if you don't buy my Davenport card, Judge, my case has real life impacts about civilian casualties. There's been a murdering of men, women, children, infants, sexual assaults, etc., committed by the U.S. military. So we need to look at actual probable impacts and move away from nuclear impacts that are trying to minimize the importance of actually probable events that are really happening. Moving on to contention 2, my opponent talks about Iran proxy wars and deterrence. Judge, we have stayed for decades and decades in the Middle East, and all we've done is make the situation worse. In my case, I talk about how Libya, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and Palestine, we've made situations a lot worse. Currently, in Palestine, over 20,000 civilians have been killed in hospitals, in schools, due to the U.S. supporting Israel in the Israel-Palestine war, and we can see how about 50,000 casualties have been occurred. Otherwise, there were about 19,000 casualties in 1 year. So we can see that U.S. Strikes have actually caused more civilian terrorism as well, because these terrorist groups use these U.S. attacks as an excuse to show this is what the U.S. does, and this is why you need to support us. So my opponent's when she was responding to my first contention, she was talking about human rights abuses and how the risk for terrorism remains. The reason the risk for terrorism remains is due to U.S. impact. Judge, the reason these citizens are being radicalized, my opponent entirely dropped this contention. This is Hudson 20 and Pillar et al. 20. Flow this through. The reason terrorism happens is due to U.S. military presence. This radicalizes the citizens, and this is why we see human rights abuses for women, for children, etc. My opponent's third contention, she doesn't really have any utilitarian impacts as to what that would do. So I'm not sure where she was exactly getting at with that. But in her and when she was responding to my second contention, she says the U.S. military isn't sure. She just provides analytics. She has no evidence for this, Judge. In my second contention, I provide plenty of evidence for this. In my Varian Kavanaugh 23 card, we can see how I say that Varian Kavanaugh 23 explains that Biden's costly overstretch strains U.S. military resources. It's leaving Washington unprepared for crises in the Indo-Pacific, and there's the threat of there's China's missile threat we will not be available in Asia to defend China's missile threat if we keep the current amount of troops in West Asia, North Africa. So, Judge, I have cards, and my opponent has no evidence to back what she was saying. So, Judge, therefore, I strongly urge an affirmative ballot.
Okay. So often roadmap, I will extend my case, go on NEG flow, and then go on AFF flow, weighing voters. Extend condition 1, Saudi Arabia. Continue withdrawal destroys perceived U.S. security commitments to Saudi. Bahrain losses of assurances causes Saudi proliferation due to fear of Iranian attacks and wider armors, which other Arab countries will follow. Eventually, due to fear of being attacked by each other, Middle East nuclear armors goes nuclear. My opponent's Davenport 24 evidence does not mean that nuclear war does not happen. The AFF does not have fiat diplomacy, which means they cannot say diplomacy solves, especially since there's no diplomacy right now. So don't believe in Davenport in the first place. It's literally a blog post. Our evidence is from actual policy planning. And then also, she said, like, and second, Iran does not produce nuclear weapons solely because of U.S. deterrence. And 3, you should vote for this contention because existential risk outweighs everything else. And Under my contention two, Iran is currently engaged in a proxy war with US, and only due to military presence, US successfully deterred these attacks. Without US presence, these attacks will be on American soil. Another 9/11 will resurge, and US withdrawal will guarantee Middle East war. My opponent says we make situation worse. However, it is like by quoting something from Iran Palestine. However, it is not, her argument is non-unique because Israel currently they can be dependent on their own weapons, and if US withdraw, other Europe countries can also fund Israel. So her argument on Israel Palestine is completely non-unique. And also judges should vote for the contention too, because I'm talking about we should deter those terrorist groups and those Iran and other powers, because we do not want another 9/11 happens again on American soil. And contention three is flexibility. So military presence allow more posture flexibility for US deployment. My opponent completely drops my contention because they agree that an obligation for permanent reduction is immoral. And again, judge, because ought to in the resolution implies that all withdrawal is an obligation, and she have conceded to all my definitions that substantial is permanent withdrawal. So US does not have an obligation to hurt its own self-interest and make an impact that is irreversible. So judge, even if you buy the argument that US should withdraw, but don't forget the resolution is calling for an obligation for permanent withdrawal, which we completely do not have this obligation. And she says I have no utilitarian impact, but for this contention, but I'm gonna explain it further on in my fill-in argument. And so onto her case. So first of all, on her first contention, she has no response at all to my link turns on the abuses and the fill-in link turns. So judge, you should auto vote for that. Do not let her bring it up in TOAR and extend my arguments. So first of all, AFF has provided no solvency. Substantial withdrawal will not solve anything. And second of all, their argument is non-unique because if US only substantial with reduction, even there's single one base in the world, one troop, US troop in other places, things like anti-Americanism will still happen. And later on, I'm going to explain why anti-Americanism is not the root cause of all these impacts. And she has dropped my fill-in arguments completely. AFF exacerbates human rights violations and all the impacts that they're talking about. Their impact can only be accessed by the NEG because after US withdrawal, great powers like China and Russia will fill in, and these countries support terrorist groups, and all those terrorist groups, local powers, and great powers is going to fill in. Like, for example, China supported Taliban al-Assad. In February, they have accepted credentials from Taliban, and Russia has supported Iran, Lebanon, Houthi, Hamas, and Russia has provided more support to Uganda, Ethiopia, even during the Ukraine war. So these countries are supporting more violations to local people and creates more hostility. And she have completely drops my argument on ISS. We need to eradicate them first in order to turn to other strategic locations, because we need to stop them from further attacks and eradicate them completely. And if we have eradicated 95% of ISS in the Wana region, if we withdraw all our past decades of efforts, it will become futile. And my opponent's argument on local hostility based is on anti-Americanism is based on history. Today, like I stated in my first contention, many allies are relying on US. The permanent US bases in Wana are largely on countries along vital waterways such as Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, UAE, Djibouti. None of these countries are experiencing significant anti-US movements. And also my opponent claim on the root cause is wrong. US have supported universal values, democracy, freedom, equality, human rights. The root cause of the attacks on US troops is the other terrorist groups want to fill in US power vacuum. They want to spread terrorist ideas and expand their power and degrade US influence. So this is a root cause, and we need to stop them from doing that. So judge, you should vote for the negative, because I have completely turned their entire case. And we have best upheld utilitarians because we prevent nuclear war from happening, and we have also can be drawn to other strategic locations because of flexibility, and because nuclear war will not happen and regional war will not happen in the NEG world. And also, you should vote for the negative because nuclear war outweighs. I win on a devastating war will occur if we pull out right now, and I win on magnitude probability because due to my link, nuclear war will happen in the NEG world, and nuclear war will the radioactive from nuclear war will spread across the entire continent, and it's worse than every single time my opponent is talking about. And also I turned their their impact on instability, because referred to my field in argument, and I also went on irreversibility, referred to my contention through inflexibility. We do not have the obligation for permanent reduction, and also existential risk at waste. We cannot prevent nuclear war 100% from not from happening. So we should prioritize existential risk. We need to stop it from happening, and only deterrence and assurance will work. If we stop it from the eve of nuclear war, it's too late, and U.S. will be hard to de-escalate. So Judge, I urge you for negative ballot. Thank you.
All right, time will begin now. All right, let's start off with talking about my opponent's first contention. She talks about how nuclear waste outweighs all. My opponent cold conceded my argument where I said that nuclear war has very little probability due to mutually assured destruction. I talked about math theory, where because everyone knows that everyone's these countries aren't gonna do nuclear war because they realize that one nuclear war is gonna lead to the end of all, so it's not going to happen. Anyways, I also talked about how nuclear war, like the excuse of nuclear war, has led to us diverting from actually important things that are really happening in real life. For example, like the sexual assault that has happened due to U.S. military presence. And my opponent also talks about, she keeps mentioning how another 9/11 was research. Judge, the reason 9/11 happened in the first place due to Osama bin Laden was because of U.S. military presence in Saudi Arabia. Judge, I have historical precedent on my side. My opponent cold conceded where I talked about ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Osama bin Laden all radicalized due to U.S. military presence. My opponent also dropped my Hudson 20 and Pillar 20 evidence, where I talked about clearly, and this is going to be one of the main reasons you vote for us today, is because terrorist organizations, the way they get their support is due to citizens. And these citizens are radicalized by U.S. military presence. U.S. military presence and their drone strikes cause radicalization, and this in turn leads to support for terrorist organizations. My opponent talks about how we must eradicate ISIS. ISIS wouldn't have existed if the U.S. hadn't been there. And additionally, ISIS needs citizen support, which they're getting from U.S. military presence. My opponent completely dropped the main argument, Judge, which is why you're going to flow that through and see how terrorism increases, which is going to lead to more civilian casualties due to U.S. military presence. My opponent's third contention, she talks about the fill in of Russia and China. She talks about how obligation is immoral. Judge, we both agreed on a framework of utilitarianism. What is immoral is what's causing the most amount of casualties, most amount of deaths, and has some kind of probability of causing the most amount of harm to society as a whole, which we can see is through American military's attacks on civilians and how we're supporting terrorism instead of reducing it. My opponent keeps talking about deterrence, but Judge, this is what U.S. presidents have said for decades and decades, is that we're fighting the war on terror, and their fighting the war on terror has led to the rise of 3 different terror groups and has led to bad conditions in Libya, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Palestine. If it's really so helpful for us to have military presence, why has that not solved? My opponent also talks about I also talk about how China has a strong military and we need to defend against the China missile crisis. My opponent again had no evidence saying that we're not spread out. So we can see how U.S. military is short based on a wearing having a 23 card, and we need to protect against China's missile crisis. We can see how China's been bullying its neighbors. So Judge, at the end of the day, don't vote for nuclear war, because again, it has very little probability. It takes attention away from real things that could actually happen. And in fact, we're stuck on hypothetical scenarios. We can also see that we can see how it's caused terrorism, U.S. military presence, and historically we can see how U.S. military presence has been harmful, which ties into utilitarianism. Thank you.
Good debate. Thank you.
Good debate.